The glare of the lights was blinding. When the captured men of the German U-boat fleets were hauled onto the upper decks of the transport ships, they instinctively threw their hands over their eyes, bracing for the inevitable scream of air raid sirens. They waited for the darkness. They waited for the blackout curtains, the searchlights, the frantic scramble of a city preparing for the devastation of night bombers. But the darkness never came. Instead, standing at the railing in their salt-stained uniforms, the hardened veterans of the Kriegsmarine stared in absolute terrifying disbelief at the skyline of New York City. The skyscrapers were ablaze with electricity. Neon signs flashed in the harbor. Car headlights streamed endlessly across the suspension bridges, entirely exposed, entirely unafraid. To a German soldier in the middle of a global war, this was not a beautiful sight. It was a psychological weapon. It was the horrifying realization that the enemy they had been fighting was not rationing power, was not hiding in the dark, and was not bleeding to death. They were thriving. And later in this story, you'll discover the one seemingly innocent, almost laughable item the Americans possessed that mathematically proved to every single German prisoner that their entire war was already lost. To understand the profound culture shock experienced by German POWs in American prison camps, you have to understand the mind of the men who were captured. By the time the North African campaign collapsed in the burning sands of Tunisia, the men of Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps were broken. They were the elite. They were the tip of the spear of the Wehrmacht. But they had spent months surviving on meager rations of hardtack, suffering from dysentery, and watching their supply lines from across the Mediterranean get systematically annihilated by the Royal Navy. When they finally surrendered to the advancing American and British forces, they fully expected to be treated with the same brutal, merciless cruelty that the Third Reich inflicted upon its own prisoners on the Eastern Front. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine had spent years drilling a specific image into the minds of the German military. The Americans, they were told, were gangsters. They were undisciplined savages from a collapsed Depression-era society that lacked the racial purity and industrial discipline of the fatherland. The German High Command promised their men that the United States was a hollow shell, teetering on the edge of starvation and ruin. But what they didn't know was that their journey into captivity would utterly shatter every lie they had ever been told. The shock began at the docks in North Africa. As the thousands of defeated Germans were marched toward the transport ships, they braced themselves for the rotting rust-bucket freighters they assumed the Allies would use. Instead, they were loaded into the cavernous hulls of American Liberty ships. The sheer volume of these vessels defied German logic. German U-boat commanders had spent the last 2 years sinking millions of tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic. They had been awarded the Knight's Cross for their devastating kill counts. They believed they had strangled the American supply lines. Yet here, floating in the Mediterranean, was an endless, horizon-spanning armada of brand-new cargo ships rolling off American assembly lines faster than the Kriegsmarine could ever hope to sink them. The voyage across the Atlantic was supposed to be a journey into darkness. Instead, the prisoners were given clean bunks, they were handed fresh water, and then the meals began. At first, the starving men of the Wehrmacht thought it was a trick. When the American mess cooks handed them trays loaded with fresh white bread, thick cuts of meat, real butter, and hot coffee, the Germans hesitated. In the crumbling ruins of the Third Reich, real coffee was a luxury reserved for the highest-ranking party officials. Butter was heavily rationed. Yet here, the lowest-ranking American enlisted men were eating like German generals. When the Liberty ships finally docked in ports like New York, Boston, and Norfolk, the prisoners were ushered onto land. They expected a grueling forced march into barbed wire holding pens. They expected the brutal crack of rifle butts and the barking of dogs. Instead, they were escorted to the railway stations. And this is where the story takes a dark turn, not into physical torture, but into profound psychological torment. The trains waiting for them were not cattle cars. They were not the freezing wooden slatted freight trains that the SS used to transport human cargo across Europe. The Americans had requisitioned luxury Pullman sleeper cars. When the German soldiers stepped inside, they found upholstered velvet seats, they found clean windows, they found sleeping berths with fresh white linens. As the trains lurched forward, beginning their journey deep into the American interior, the prisoners sat in stunned silence. African-American railway porters walked down the aisles, handing out boxed lunches containing ham sandwiches, fresh apples, and cartons of milk. For the German officers, this was not a relief. It was a creeping, suffocating terror. As the trains rolled westward, the prisoners pressed their faces against the glass. They were looking for the war. They were looking for the bombed-out factories, the cratered roads, the shattered train yards that defined the European landscape. But the American landscape was untouched. For days, the trains rolled past the steel mills of Pennsylvania, their smokestacks vomiting fire and smoke into the sky, running 24 hours a day, completely immune to the threat of the Luftwaffe. They rolled past the endless golden wheat fields of the Midwest, where solitary tractors harvested enough grain to feed entire armies. They passed through small towns where the streets were lined with brand-new automobiles, gleaming in the sunlight. Every mile of track was a nail in the coffin of the German war machine. The sheer, incomprehensible scale of American industrial capacity was laid bare before their eyes. One captured Luftwaffe pilot, staring out at the endless miles of Texas, reportedly turned to his commanding officer and whispered, "We have made a terrible mistake." If you're still watching, what comes next will change how you see the outcome of this war. The destination for many of these men were massive, sprawling internment camps built in places like Aliceville, Alabama, and Camp Clinton, Mississippi. By the end of the war, over 400,000 German prisoners would be housed in the United States. When the massive gates of Camp Aliceville swang open, the prisoners were greeted by clean, neatly organized barracks. There were shower blocks with running hot water. There were massive mess halls, recreation fields, and medical facilities stocked with medicine that German doctors could only dream of having on the Eastern Front. The Americans adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention. In fact, they went beyond it. The War Department believed that if they treated German prisoners impeccably, the Nazi government might treat captured American GIs with the same leniency. But the unintended consequence of this policy was the complete psychological defeat of the German soldier. The camps had their own canteens. Prisoners were paid a small daily wage for agricultural or manual labor, usually picking cotton or harvesting peanuts. With this money, they could walk into the camp store and purchase items that were virtually extinct in Germany. They bought cartons of cigarettes, they bought Hershey's chocolate bars, they bought endless bottles of ice-cold Coca-Cola. Some camps even allowed the prisoners to purchase beer. It was within these canteens that the ultimate crushing realization occurred. The ultimate blow to German morale didn't come from a bomb or a tank or an artillery shell. It came from desert. When the German prisoners discovered that the American supply chain was so vast, so incredibly robust, and so completely unthreatened that it could afford to manufacture, ship, and distribute thousands of gallons of ice cream to its own troops and to its prisoners, the mathematical reality of the war settled in. A nation that was fighting a two-front war across two massive oceans, producing thousands of M4 Sherman tanks and B-17 flying fortresses, still had the excess industrial capacity to build dedicated concrete barges in the Pacific, whose sole purpose was to churn out ice cream for the Navy. The Germans knew how hard it was to get a single Kar 98K rifle replacement part to the front lines in Russia. The Americans were shipping luxury desserts across the globe. The war was over. It had been over the moment it started.
Many prisoners wrote letters back to their families in Germany. They tried to describe the food. They tried to describe the lights, the cars, the peacefulness of the American towns. But the German censors often intercepted these letters, blacking out the descriptions of American abundance, terrified that the civilian population would realize the hopelessness of their situation. Some German families who did receive the letters refused to believe them. They wrote back accusing their sons and husbands of being coerced into writing American propaganda. To a mother starving in the rubble of Berlin, the idea of her son eating roasted chicken and drinking Coca-Cola in an Alabama prison camp was simply impossible to comprehend. But it was real. As the war finally dragged to its bloody, catastrophic end in May of 1945, the atmosphere in the American camps shifted. The abundance remained, but the psychological weight of the Holocaust was brought to American shores. The U.S. military gathered the German prisoners into
the camp theaters. The lights went down, and the projectors flickered to life. But they were not showing Hollywood films. They showed the raw, unedited combat footage captured by Allied forces liberating the concentration camps: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The prisoners sat in the dark, watching the mountains of emaciated corpses being pushed into mass graves by bulldozers. They watched the hollow, haunted eyes of the survivors. For years, many of these soldiers had convinced themselves they were fighting a noble war for the survival of their nation. Now, sitting in the absolute safety of a country they were sworn to destroy, they were forced to look at the abyss their beloved fatherland had created. The silence in those theaters was deafening. Men wept, men vomited. Some tore the military insignia off their uniforms in sheer disgust. The culture shock of the American prison camps was complete. They had arrived expecting to find a weak, degenerate nation, and instead found an invincible industrial titan. They had arrived believing in their own absolute moral and military superiority, only to be confronted with the devastating proof of their own national depravity. When the surviving men of the Afrika Korps and the U-boat fleets finally returned to Germany in 1946, they did not return as conquerors. They returned to a shattered, divided nation, carrying with them the memories of a land untouched by war, a land of light, steel, and endless abundance that had quietly and effortlessly crushed the 1,000-year Reich. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, because the darkest tales of World War II are the ones they tried to bury.